Welcome to the second episode of the Whiskey and Book Club, joined by the inestimable Jim Cornelius from Frontier Partisans. Jim, if you don't mind starting out by telling us a little bit about yourself and about your years-long, decades-long Frontier Partisans project and about your new podcast.
Okay, will do. Yeah, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite. I appreciate it a lot. So my name is Jim Cornelius. I live in Central Oregon on the east slope of the Cascade Mountains, and I edit the Nugget newspaper in Sisters, Oregon. That's my day job. And for as long as I can remember, I was fascinated with frontier history, and my blog is frontierpartisans.com. I started it in 2011, and it was really just about exploring the history and the lore of frontiers, not just in North America, but all across the world. A lot of folks don't realize that the frontier experience was a common one across the world, from Africa, Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, Australia, and I like to do a little bit of comparative history. I don't consider myself a historian. I got my degree in history, but I think of myself as a historical storyteller and nonfiction, but a storyteller nonetheless. And recently I've gone from strictly the written word to podcasting. Mm-hmm. The Frontier Partisans podcast. I just launched that a couple weeks ago.
Great. And we'll talk more about that. As you know, at Hillbilly Highways, I talk a lot about a particular frontier. First, the Scottish-English border and the people who left there and came to America and settled along the Appalachian Mountains, and then went west and everywhere from there. So the Kit Carson story is very much in line with that. But I went with a Western theme for you. I've got my Corblund t-shirt.
Corb.
I've got drinking some High West double rye whiskey.
Oh, you went AO on this. Excellent.
Yeah, from my metal camping mug.
Right on.
And then the first book I wanted to talk about is Trapline, Outlaw, about a guy named Simon Peter Gunnanoot, who was a Native American in British Columbia, allegedly murdered two men in 1906. And what originally drew me to the story, what would probably be of most interest to you, is he then spent 13 years in the wilderness of British Columbia evading capture. And the particular book that I read talking about this story isn't super interested in that. Kind of downplays the romantic nature of it. Downplays how difficult it was, in part because he had his children and his mother and father with him, although his father died pretty early on. Although I don't think it makes it overall less impressive. Although I think the more impressive people there were not Simon himself, but his children and his mother, who dealt with that. And also points out that there was a lot of ineptitude that prevented the authorities from capturing him. The book itself is really interested in kind of diving into the legal aspects. And I'm a lawyer by training, so that was interesting as well. And what I really found interesting, this reminded me of a couple of kind of cases of the century in the United States. And this was kind of a case of the century before we had CNN. One, it reminds me of something that happened here where I'm at now, back in Western North Carolina, with Eric Rudolph, who was on the run so long.
Oh, yeah.
And for him to be able to do that, two things were necessary. One, the FBI had to be super inept. I remember one of my professors talking about how they said they knew he was in the area because dogs were barking at night. Of course, if you live in the mountains, the dogs bark at night all of the time because there are a lot of animals around. We've already had our first bear incident. And then the other thing is he wouldn't have been able to do what he did without help. And Simon Gunnanoot had a lot of help. And part of what the author points out is the people in the wilderness of British Columbia were not super interested in helping the authorities because they had to survive in the wilderness. And, they relied on the people who were there.
It sounds quite a bit also like the Claude Dallas story, if you're familiar with that.
I'm not. Yeah, what happened with Claude Dallas?
Claude Dallas was he grew up in Ohio, but he moved west to Oregon initially in the 1970s and was a buckaroo. And then he became a trapper, and he killed 2 game wardens in northern Nevada in 1980 or 81. I can't remember the dates exactly, but it became a real national celebrity case. He had his picture on featured in a National Geographic piece, so he was already known and similar situation in that he had a lot of help from people who weren't interested in helping the authorities at all, and he was on the run for quite a while, for about a year, I guess, a year and a half, captured, convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, and then he escaped from prison and was on the run for another year and a half, and he just finished out his sentence about 3 years ago, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago, and he's somewhere. We don't know exactly where.
Yeah. The other case of the century this makes me think of is OJ. Something more in the West. Simon, like OJ, he was a minority in a white man's world. He was successful. He was a business owner, accused of murder that he probably committed. It became this huge publicity thing. The trial was moved from the location where it would have otherwise been for publicity reasons. Like OJ, he was acquitted. So that aspect was also pretty fascinating to read about.
Acquitted on what grounds? How did his lawyer manage that?
Just on, I think, the grounds of, well, one, he wouldn't have been acquitted had he turned himself in at the time. Normally, running doesn't help you out legally, but he became a celebrity over that time, and that matters. And then we don't really know what happened. He got into an altercation. The people he got into altercation, the guy he got into altercation with was killed down the road. He didn't have an alibi, but we really don't know what happened.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of frontier murders never got solved. The law in the U.S., in most of the U.S., for most of its history, could be summed up as murder is wrong unless you have a reason. Not necessarily a good reason, but a reason.
Yeah. And the celebrity outlaw thing is interesting because there's a pattern there. You see very similar patterns repeated. He was a handsome dude.
Yeah. And that
probably didn't hurt him.
All right. So what are you reading?
Well, I just, are you familiar with Peter Matthiessen's Killing Mr. Watson trilogy?
I am not.
It occurs to me that you would like it quite a lot. I read Peter Matthiewsen had this magnificent obsession with the story of E.J. Watson, who allegedly and probably did kill Belle Starr in the Indian Territory, and then he moved to Western Florida, and in the first part of the 20th century, and he became kind of a big wheel entrepreneur there. But he was a charismatic outlaw figure, and his neighbors were terrified of him. And in 1910, they lynched him. He pulled up to shore in a motorboat, and his neighbors, about 11 of his neighbors, opened fire on him and killed him. And Peter Matthiewsen developed this obsession with this story, and he wrote a trilogy. Killing Mr. Watson was the first book, and I read all 3 of them back in the 90s when I worked in a bookstore. And then because of this crazy obsession, he wrote another book, kind of consolidating all the trilogies, and said this is the one that's really the right book, the best telling of the story.
Yeah.
And so I don't read a whole lot of fiction, but I jumped in big because this is like 900 pages, but it's called Shadow Country, and it's the territory that he was in was, the 10,000 islands in Western Florida, which was truly a frontier way into the 20th century. And most of the folks that lived there were misfits of one kind or another, and real characters. And Matthiewsen's got this incredible, it's all told in, the first book, the first part of this book is told in multiple points of view by the people who lived in this 10,000 islands area. And he's got this amazing ability to capture voices, and he writes beautifully. And you know how difficult it is to capture that rural voice without making it sound like a caricature, and also get some flights of description in there that don't sound like somebody else talking. And it's an amazing piece of work. And Watson is another one of those charismatic outlaw figures. We love him.
Yeah. And so much of what draws me to this subgenre country noir is that you get the outlaws, you get the kind of pulp aspect of the crime, the actual interesting things happening, the violence, but also dialogue that's true to a particular place. And I grew up here, I grew up in this, so if it doesn't ring true to me, I'm going to bounce off of it. And then also a lot of really quality writing of literary merit. And to be able to bring all of those things together results in some pretty special books when it works.
Yeah, and we're so lucky that there's so much of it happening now. There's really, your blog and a couple of Facebook groups. The stack of books that I want to read is huge because there's just so much good stuff now. Yeah,
it's a good time. Almost sort of in that vein, the second book I want to talk about is The Landbreakers by John Ehle. So John Ehle was a guy from Asheville. Although he spent time in Chapel Hill, which the two places in North Carolina that will corrupt you are Chapel Hill and Raleigh. But he wrote a series of 7 books kind of exploring the settlement of Western North Carolina. A buddy of mine said, hey, I have a bone to pick with your blog. You haven't talked about John Ehle. So I read the first book, The Landbreakers, which is a historical fiction about the very first people to settle at least one part of Western North Carolina.
And what time frame are we talking?
So this would have been late 1700s, right after the Revolution. So the guys from Tennessee that fought in Kings Mountain were kind of crossing back and forth. And you have some of the Scots-Irish. It's interesting. John Ehle had English heritage. I have both Scots-Irish and English heritage. I had some people who came through Jamestown and then came through the North Carolina Piedmont. And there was a tendency by Southerners, English Southerners with that heritage from downcountry, to minimize the role of the Scots-Irish, the Highlanders. W.J. Cash's The Mind of the South is really bad about that.
Yeah, that's an Anglo-Saxon South for him.
Yeah. So Mooney, the main character in the book, he isn't Scots-Irish. Well, he comes from an indentured servant background. Him and his wife, when they finished their service, got their payment, took that money and went and bought land. And then kind of the antagonist character is an evil rich guy who owns slaves. And then there are some kind of dissolute hillbilly characters who don't want to work. And part of the theme of the book is the difficulty of carving this settlement out with kind of the dregs of society. This isn't the best land. This American South, before we over-farmed it with tobacco and cotton, had some of the finest farmland in the world, but that was not up here.
Right.
But we had some things. We had an abundance of wood. In the Kit Carson podcast episode, the Scots-Irish one, you mentioned girdling trees. So I was reading about Empire's The Summer Moon, the book about the Comanches, the difficulties that the American frontiers people faced when they got to where there was no wood. There's that line in Texas where you go from the green Texas to the brown Texas.
Right.
People who write books, make films and TV don't really understand that there's a green Texas. But you get to the point where you run out of books, you run out of trees. Can't make books without trees.
No books either, right?
Yeah, but in the mountains of North Carolina, they had so many trees that they would just utterly waste trees by girdling them. Because it was just too much work to just cut them down the hard way. So I know you'll be sad to hear there's no conflict with the Native Americans. There's no frontier partisans warfare. There are some phenomenal set pieces involving nature and conflicts against nature. There's a scene with wolves. There's a scene with bears. A lot of really good literary writers write terrible set pieces. The third book I'm going to talk about, the set piece at the end, isn't that great. I know you and I are both big fans of James McLaughlin's Bearskin.
Yes.
I have a couple bone to pick with that book. One bone to pick, he kind of mocks the natives as being scared of snakes. So I have extricated a snake from my room and removed it to the outside.
Yeah, well, I've got an Indiana Jones level phobia about snakes, so.
Yeah, no, I'm not there. One, I will remove a snake from my house if I find one. Two, we're not wrong to be scared of snakes. There's a scene in this book involving snakes. You should probably avoid this book. If you have an Indiana Jones level phobia of snakes, it'll be much, much worse after this book. There is one of the most terrifying scenes I've ever read involving snakes in here.
Okay, you got me though. That sounds like a book I gotta read. I mean, that is kind of in the wheelhouse.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, you mentioned the English heritage, and as you I think I talked about this a bit in the podcast about Kit Carson's people. You know, one of the things that David Hackett Fischer points out in his book Albion Seed about the four British folkways in North America, which is that's just a great resource, wonderful book. You know, not everyone in the backcountry was Scots-Irish, but the culture was so well suited to that area and the challenges of that area that a lot of other ethnic groups sort of adopted their cultural characteristics. And, you know, I think that's true of the English settlers. Daniel Boone was of English descent. And there were a lot of Germans also on the frontier. It wasn't all Scots-Irish by any means, but that culture was so potent for that region that Germans and English and you know, French Huguenots that were there kind of became subsumed into it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've noticed is that culture is really great at assimilating people. My mom came from outside of that culture. Despite the fact that she had been living here for years before she buried my dad, she was very much an outsider. Took my family a while to warm up to her, but you know, once you're in, you're in. My dad has been dead for 20 years, and that family bond is still there.
Yeah, it's a really kind of an old-fashioned sort of kinship ethic. James Webb talks about that in his book Born Fighting. You know, he married a Vietnamese woman, and she's accepted into that kin network of his. So, yeah, I think that's a super important point, that it was an adaptable culture, and it was also a culture that assimilated people a lot.
Yeah, I read, it's been a long time since I read Born Fighting. I need to revisit it. I didn't
Yeah,
like
well,
it.
I write in James Webb for president. I did in 2016. I did in 2020 as well. So he's my president.
Yeah. But David Hackett Fischer is the patron saint of the Hillbilly Studies leg of the Hillbilly Highways blog Tripod, along with Ron Rash for the Country Noir, which I'm going to talk about for the next book, and then Chris Knight for the Texas Country.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for real. Yeah.
Which is a very, very Texas thing to do. The reason that Kentuckyan Chris Knight is Texas Country is because they paid for it. Because he comes to Texas to make money.
Yeah.
So he can do shows there.
Yeah. Well, you could be a regional artist in Texas and make well, at least you could before COVID, make a real good living.
Yeah. He was the last concert I saw pre-COVID. Late February, I caught him in Oklahoma.
Good show.
Yeah, great show. Very, very small venue. Apparently nobody had COVID, or we all would have had it. Very intimate. He talked more than he has in the past. The crowd was a little bit too rowdy, but there were some benefits to that. He sounded good. I've seen him a bunch of times, and the 2 times before that, he was a little iffy. So he was back in form. It was good.
Good.
All right. So what else are you reading?
Well, for my next blog series, this is not an attractive book, so I'm not going to show it to you, but it's a great one. I decided to do my next podcast series, which will launch in January, on the Scottish Highlanders. Again, talking about frontier cultures across the world. Scotland was a frontier from the time of the Romans and the Picts, and continued to be so really up until the middle of the 18th century. And then a lot of Scottish Highlanders ended up in the frontiers of the British Empire. They were, as one writer described, they were kind of the shock troops of empire after their own culture was colonized. And so I'm reading Colin C. Calloway's White People, Indians, and Highlanders, which is I've read it before, but I'm using it as a research tool for this next podcast, and it's just an absolutely fantastic book. Calloway is he's sort of one of the deans of the borderland history movement, which sees, rather than hardline frontiers between civilization and savagery, which is kind of the old triumphalist way of looking at frontiers, borderland history treats these areas as zones of cultural interaction. And sometimes it's friction, and sometimes it's trade interaction. Sometimes it's a mixture of both. And the Highland culture had a lot of affinities with native culture. And also there were some considerable ironies. The British talked about the Irish and the Scots very much in the same vein that they talked about the Indians of North America, and treated them similarly. And the Highland clearances can be looked at as analogous to Indian removal and things like that. So the Highlanders had this real affinity culturally with the Native Americans, but they also sometimes acted as colonizers themselves, and that's a phenomenon that just fascinates me. And so it's a wonderful book that delves into both cultures, their interaction. There's a lot about the fur trade, and one area, I'm not all that deeply versed in the Canadian fur trade and the Hudson Bay Company, and I'm learning more about that. And Hudson Bay Company was just full of Scots. It was basically, in the 19th century, it was run by Scots, and many of whom became acculturated to native peoples and became Métis Scots. Métis, which is the same word as mestizo. It's a half breed is the old fashioned way of saying it. So this book keeps me up at night. It's a history book, but it's a page turner as well.
Mm-hmm. People from this part of the country famously like to claim Cherokee heritage, most of which is not true. But there is something to it, because the view at the time was that there was nothing wrong with that. It was illegal in North Carolina because interracial marriages were barred, so you would just lie on the marriage certificate. So it's hard to prove with the legal document, but there was a lot of intermarriage. I have a personal connection to the Scottish soldier for the Empire. My wife's great-grandfather was a Scottish soldier in Burma.
Oh, wow.
With a Mon woman, which is how her family came to be. So they've got this interesting connection with the Scots going everywhere.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, one of the themes of my work on Frontier Partisans is that, you know, these frontier conditions and frontier themes have a lot of continuity and persistence, and that intermarriage with the native peoples of the hinterlands of the world has happened for hundreds and hundreds of years. And interestingly, I have a guest post on the most recent post on Frontier Partisans is a guest post about George MacDonald Fraser's book Quartered Safe Out Here, which is about his service in Burma in World War II. Great combat memoir.
Yeah, which is fascinating because to Americans, World War II in Southeast Asia did not exist. I've been to the World War II Museum, just nothing on it because the Americans weren't fighting there. My wife's grandfather served in World War II, and he was in Burma. So the entire another theater of the war that we're generally not, as Americans, very aware of.
Yeah, and extraordinarily tough wilderness fighting. Yeah, that's a fascinating theater. It really is. Mm-hmm. That's. Have you read Quartered Safe Out Here?
No.
Yeah, that's. I'll put another one on your stack. I think you would love it, and especially with that family connection. George MacDonald Fraser wrote the Flashman books.
Yeah. I knew about the Flashman books. I read that post and opened up an entire other world of Fraser that I was not aware of.
Yeah, and he wrote History of the Border Reivers, the Steel Bonnets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that one I think is already on the stack. That's the one I'll get to. That and the one Flashman book I have somewhere on my shelves. Which you can't see it. I did have just boxes and boxes of books all over my office where I'm recording this, and I sort of shoved them out of the camera view.
Well, through the door that you can see open behind me are stacks of boxes of books that have never gotten. We've only been here a couple of years.
Yeah, one day my bookcase buying will catch up with my book buying.
Yeah, maybe.
So another patron saint of the Hillbilly Highways blog is Ron Rash. He's another guy. He mostly writes about Western North Carolina. This book, which was his second, is actually set on the South Carolina-Georgia border. Saints at the River. It pulls in a lot of the themes that I love so much. The explores throughout his book. The main character is in her late 20s. She grew up in the region, what's called the dark country of the dark corner of South Carolina, but left for a career in journalism and comes back to cover a story. It's based on a real story about a girl who died in the river. And there's also the conflict between development, between the natives, and between environmental concerns. The conflict at the core of the story is, should they disturb the river in an attempt to recover this young girl's body? And there are concerns that if that happens, it'll open the door to development. Ron Rash comes to the one theme he talks about a lot is the displacement of the people who were here because of all of these dams, all of these man-made created rivers. that supplies so much power to the area. People lived under the water. The Smoky Mountain National Park, people lived there and were removed so the park could be there. So I love those stories. That's something that Bearskin gets into very much from the perspective of an outsider, because the main character in that book isn't from here. So even though I have a lot of sympathy with the environmental concerns, I'm always sympathetic to kind of the native perspective, because so much of the decision making is as if we were not here.
And what do you think of the book?
It's good. This is his second book. It's a little rough around the edges. It pretty closely hews to the historical story. He did make the girl who dies younger. He also kind of adds a set piece at the end, which isn't super effective. Like I said, a lot of really good literary writers don't write good set pieces. So it's not his best book, but it's really good. And Ron Rash at his worst is still good. Although I think my least favorite Ron Rash book is Serena, which is his most famous book.
Right.
Probably for the same reasons, because it's from the perspective of an outsider. Is I think why a lot of people like it, and it's why I like it the least.
Yeah, I think sometimes those kind of mediating figures work well for for folks who aren't from a region, but I could see how it'd be off-putting too. And I noticed in your review of Daniel Woodrell's books, you said something to the effect that the third book was probably the most pleasing to the Iowa. What's the Iowa
Writers
Writing?
Workshop.
Yeah, workshop, and therefore it doesn't work. And I have similar sentiments about that. I love Daniel Woodrell, and he's I think he's as good as they come, but I don't think he needs that literary gloss at all. And I haven't read as much Ron Rash as you have. He seems to be the guy that speaks to you the most of all the books that you've reviewed.
Yeah, he's a little more on the literary side. He's not his works typically aren't as violent as Daniel Woodrell. Although I think as he saw that the meth epidemic hit, he got a little bit more pessimistic. But what I love about it so much is that it is set here. Almost all of his stories are set in Western North Carolina.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So it's just so close to what I grew up with. He's also a master of the short stories. Daniel Woodrell's Outlaw album is maybe the best collection of short stories I've ever read. But Ron Rash has a bunch of collections of short stories.
Yeah. Yeah. And have you read Woodrell's Civil War novel, Woe to Live On? It was made into the movie Ride with the Devil. Very underrated movie. That's an outstanding piece of work as well.
Yeah, I haven't seen either of the movies made of his books. I've only read Winter's Bone, the Outlaw album, and I just listened to the Bayou trilogy.
Yeah.
So I gotta dive the rest of the way into his. I'm almost done with Ron Rash. I'll have to actually read poetry pretty soon.
Now, I listen to a lot of podcasts, but I don't do a whole lot of audiobooks. What's the difference in the experience for you from reading to listening?
Well, the disadvantage of an audiobook is that you have to make the time to, you can't sit there and drop it for 3 months. I guess you could, but that kind of detracts from the experience, which is what made me avoid audiobooks for so long. Now, though, I'm spending a lot more time in the car. And then my concern with country noir is, there's the voice written, but you also have a narrator who can pull the voice off. So the Bayou trilogy wasn't my people. It was people from the river with kind of this French heritage. So it's a different accent. So that's what made me leery. The narrator of the Bayou trilogy is Bronson Pinchot, who's Balky from The Perfect Strangers.
Uh-huh.
I can't not mention that because I loved that show when I was a kid. And he does a good job in general. He doesn't really nail the femme fatale characters, which
Yeah, you mentioned that, and that's a shame because you got to have, like you say, you got to have a good, smoky, sexy voice for that.
yeah, and that's one thing where the pulp influence on those books, they're kind of very obviously influenced by the hard-boiled pulp novels.
Yeah.
Really shines through, which is super cool, kind of transported into this country noir setting, even though it's in a city, still country noir by my definition.
Well, I'm with you on that. Absolutely. Those are country people for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and as somebody who spent so much time in cities, I would love to see more crime fiction featuring country people who are in the city. Which is just like that seems like this huge gap in the literature.
Yeah. There's an opportunity for you.
Not I don't even have time to read, let alone write reviews, let alone between my job and my other job as a toddler wrangler.
Yeah, right. And well, and I thought that I decided to do a podcast instead of writing a second book, and turns out that it's about the same amount of work and about the same amount of time. You just can't get away from it. You can't get around that.
Yeah. And you shouldn't take any cues from me because this is the second episode of this vlogcast that I've done in the last 8 months. I had this idea I would do a lot of this in the pandemic. Didn't really work out.
Yeah. Well, life happens, gets in the way.
I did spend a giant chunk of the last 3 months on the hillbilly highways, driving back and forth from the Rust Belt to Appalachia repeatedly.
Right.
Which was lovely and made time for listening to audiobooks, but didn't leave time for much else.
Right.
All right. So what else are you reading?
Well, I got a couple of books on Daniel Boone, a couple of quite eccentric books on Daniel Boone. He was sort of the original mythology that I delved into when I was just a little kid. I guess everybody probably that's interested in frontier history kind of starts with Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett because those were the big media. And as my horizons expanded, kind of move away from that original story, but he keeps cropping up. I find myself mentioning him several times in the Kit Carson podcast, mainly because Carson's family followed the exact same migration path that Boone's family did. And you realize what a legitimately representative figure he was. That's not legend or myth. He was a very representative figure in a lot of ways. And so he keeps popping up. The first book that I found is called Boone, an Unfinished Portrait by Daniel Firth Griffith. Lovely cover. And it's an interesting book. It's like I said, they're both kind of eccentric. This is sort of a biography, but it's very much a meditation on Boone's relationship to wilderness. And it's sort of written in an academic style. It's almost a dissertation or a thesis. And for some people that's off-putting. That doesn't bother me. It's heavily footnoted and a lot of references, and he quotes at length from Emerson and Whitman and
I've noticed that the quality of academic history books varies dramatically. David Hackett Fischer wrote a really good academic history book. Right. A huge chunk of them are borderline unreadable.
Yeah, this is definitely readable and an enjoyable book. People's mileage varies on it. He's the environmental concerns that he has. And sort of what I call an interest in what I call the frontiersman's paradox, which is that you go out into the wilderness because you love being in the wilderness, and by your actions you destroy the wilderness that you love.
Yes.
That's a Western civilization story, but you'll get a kick out of this because it tickled me. He quotes Treebeard from The Lord of the Rings in here, nice. Which, Emerson, Thoreau, and Treebeard. Yes. Why not? What the hell? It's a young guy, and it that delights me. He's coming at it from a really unique perspective. And,
Well, I quote Treebeard a lot these days.
Right?
Every time somebody asks me whose side I'm on.
I
On nobody's side.
I swear, you and I are related because more than once, and it's very funny to when you trot that out, especially if you try to do it in Treebeard voice and say side. I'm not on anybody's side. He's the man, or the ant. He is the ant. But I just, I think that's that was a delightful note to me in this book, and I've enjoyed it. The other one is by a guy named Ted Franklin Belue, who he is a professor, retired now, I guess, professor of history, but also an avid reenactor of the east of the Mississippi frontier. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a book called The Hunters of Kentucky, which is a history of the Long Hunters that first crossed from Western North Carolina, Western Virginia, into Kentucky and Tennessee. And that book was a tremendous influence on me. It shaped what I do with Frontier Partisans. It was exactly what I was trying to do. He's a great storyteller, mm-hmm. and it's historical storytelling. It's very well researched. Actually, he did some groundbreaking research, but it's very much in a storytelling vein. And his new book is called Finding Daniel Boone, His Last Days in Missouri, and the Strange Fate of His Remains. So if anybody ever asks you who's buried in Boone's tomb, that's a question. And it's a question with an interesting answer or non-answer. But what I love most about this book is that Ted, it's a bit of a travel log because he's kind of on the trail of this, mm-hmm. and his interaction with the landscape and with the history of this man who was a giant presence in his life for his entire life really resonates with me. So mm-hmm. Delightful book. Again, it's very eccentric. It's not a biography, but another aspect of it that's cool is that everybody associates Daniel Boone with Kentucky, and of course he came there from the Yadkin Valley of mm-hmm. North Carolina, but he moved to Missouri permanently in 1799 and died there in 1820. He was in Missouri a long time, mm-hmm. and that's almost always neglected. That time period of his life is kind of rushed through at the end of a conventional biography, mm-hmm. and so those have been a lot of fun, and I love reconnecting with that story because it's been with me since I was probably 5 years old. So my interpretation of him as a historical figure and as a mythological figure changes as I get older, which has been an interesting thing.
Yeah, it can be scary to sort of circle back around because you don't know how you're gonna kind of re-experience that thing, but it can also be extraordinarily enriching. The travelogue aspect is interesting. Have you read any of Tony Horwitz's books from
Yes.
Confederates in the Attic on?
Well, just Confederates in the Attic, actually. Yeah. Did he die like last year?
Yeah, he put out a book and he returned to the South. He kind of followed Olmsted, the famous landscape architect who did the Biltmore house stuff. Had kind of a journalism career and had this whole trek through the South. He followed along with that, published a book, and died almost immediately after it was published. Not a super old guy, died of a heart attack.
Yes.
Tragic. I mean, I've read most of his books. I think there are a couple still out there that I haven't. I think the sort of the travelogue thing is tough to do. Every other travelogue other than his work I've bounced off of. And he does a great job illustrating some parts of history that get ignored. His book on colonial history really changed my life because Americans, like the Pilgrims, Jamestown, if you're from North Carolina, you learned about the Lost Colony, and then our country was founded. But that was a huge period of time. That's a huge chunk of American history where the entire political milieu, everything that was happening was very, very different. And we would have a greater appreciation for our history if we need to think more about English history, but also colonial history, which stretched for a very long time.
Yeah, and it would kind of serve the current zeitgeist too, because it was incredibly diverse, and culturally and ethnically. I mean, there wasn't one kind of Englishman, as David Hackett Fischer so wonderfully illustrated. And yeah, I mean, there's a couple hundred years of history there that you're right, it's completely just jumped over from, they arrived on the shore and then they did some stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what is it about Horowitz that you connect with so much? In comparison to others?
It's pop culture, but it's so easy to read. It's so conversational. He's so great at interacting with people, which I cannot do. I actually, unlike probably everybody else who's written about Hillbilly Elegy, I actually went to Jackson, Kentucky. I actually went to Middletown. The interaction was limited because I'm not the sort of person, generally speaking, who will sit in a bar and chat people up. And Tony Horowitz did a lot of that. He joked about how his cardiologist hated his work because so much of it took place in bars, which is bittersweet in retrospect.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
They're just bitter.
Well, I loved Confederates in the Attic, and one of the things that I liked about it so much is that he treated that subculture with due respect. He kind of hit a really good balance of not being too reverent about it or being disrespectful of these people, and really kind of sought to understand what it was that they were trying to connect with. And I think that, if more people read Confederates in the Attic, they would understand a little bit more about why kind of touching that's always been an electric rail, touching that Confederate heritage. I don't know. It might help.
I think
I'm
that
biased to believe that reading books helps people.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that book. They assume that it's sympathetic to the lost cause. I mean, thinking about being interested in the Civil War in this country is almost assumed to be just completely there with sympathy for the lost cause, sympathy for the South. Like Tony Horowitz, in the end, my sympathies lie with the Union. It doesn't mean that the Civil War isn't interesting. I love that he talks about how his Jewish immigrant grandfather had this interest in the Civil War. He had no personal connection with it because his people were not there at the time, but it was a momentous thing that happened in the United States. So you can be interested in it without having sympathy for the South.
Yeah,
we shouldn't kind of denigrate being interested in the Civil War.
Yeah. Well, I've got an interesting. I'm from I was born and raised in California and live now in Oregon. I'm a Westerner, and I don't have any connection with the South at all. But I always had a real love for Southern music, and that was kind of my connection, and that relationship with of Southern culture and the Civil War, you can't pry them apart very easily, and it does lead to a lot of assumptions, and the use of the Confederate flag and by Southern rock bands, it was a cultural symbol, and I don't think that any of them really intended it to be a racial or political statement, and yet, of course, it's inevitably one, and that's exploring that has been a real lesson to me in the power of symbology, because it can mean absolutely different things to different people, and neither one is wrong in what that symbol means to them. and yet, everybody wants their point of view to prevail. Well, it's heritage. Well, it's not heritage it's not the same kind of heritage, at least to a lot of Black Americans. But it doesn't mean that if you like Leonard Skinner and say, and wave your flag at Sweet Home Alabama, that you're a Ku Kluxer either. So we're just a blessedly complicated culture.
Yeah. Well, there was a fascinating thing just in how history was rewritten. And you have a work like The Outlaw Josie Wales, where the Confederate cause gets made synonymous with kind of the oppressed, and Josie takes up with the Native American characters, despite the fact that the Confederacy was generally pretty oppressive. So you have this weird thing where you've got this symbol of this oppressive secession movement gets used in ways that are very different. And a lot of the discourse around it is very simplistic and misses this kind of weird thing that's going on. And
it's very simplistic, and as I'm sure a lot of upcountry people remain Unionist, and some attempted to secede from internally from southern states. West Virginia was a secessionist from Virginia, and they seceded from Virginia, and northern Alabama and western North Carolina they were not hotbeds of Confederate sentiment.
Yeah. Maybe that was mixed. To my knowledge, I had a couple of ancestors who fought for the Confederacy and died. And I had a couple of ancestors who fought for the Tories, for the English in the American Revolution, and died, which I understand will not get you into the Sons of the American Revolution. You have to be on the right side.
Which at this remove is kind of silly. Yeah, that's another interesting aspect of history that gets that whole, the American Revolution was the first Civil War.
Yeah.
Especially in your part of the country. It was very much a civil war. Yeah. That's funny. I had never considered the fact that loyalist heritage wouldn't get you into the Sons of the American Revolution. Well, too bad for you. You can still become a Kentucky colonel if you want to.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, I've got some interesting books that I'm either reading or about to read as well. So Horace Kephart is a minor character in Ron Rash's Serena, very famous writer about the outdoors from a century ago. He was instrumental in the founding of the Smoky Mountain National Park. Wrote a very controversial book about hillbillies, but I have another one of his very famous books, Camping and Woodcraft, which he writes wonderfully about. It's not necessarily a good how-to guide. This is a very different type of camping than what we do. Very much not leave no trace.
Right.
His advice involves just the massive murder of saplings. He's like, you don't need tent poles, just cut down a bunch of saplings for everything. Also, his fire safety, probably not great.
Kephart was a fascinating guy, though. The wilderness saved him.
Yeah, he's an outsider. He wasn't from West North Carolina, although he lived his final years here.
Right. Wasn't it like Chicago or something like that? And he had a big drinking problem, and his wife left him, and connections. I've actually.
He was in St. Louis, I think. There's a really good kind of short biography at the beginning of this edition. So that was my real introduction to him.
I was very, very pleased to acquire. Ethan Becker has designed or reproduced the Horace Kephart knife, nice. Which was, he had a particular style of knife that he promoted, and this is a Kephart, and it's my everyday carry knife. Fascinating guy. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. But yeah, murderer of saplings for sure.
Today I picked up the second in the 7-book series about the settlement of West North Carolina from John Ehle. I bought The Road at City Lights Bookstore in Silva, one of the great bookstores for Appalachian literature. And this one, as I understand it, involves the railroad coming to Western North Carolina.
What time frame? When was he writing? Is he contemporary? I've never heard of him.
He is not contemporary, but not. He didn't write this a long time. Let me pull the original copyright. So this was originally published in 1967.
Okay, gosh, I don't know how I missed him. Those sound like books I need to read for sure.
I mean, I'd never heard of him before. My buddy said you gotta learn about this guy, but he was a fiction writer of some note. He was involved in North Carolina politics. Another interesting guy. And then the last book I'm about to read, also purchased at City Lights a little while ago. Even As We Breathe, written by a woman who lives in the Qualla Boundary, about a couple of Cherokee who have a romance during World War II in Asheville, North Carolina. So very Western North Carolina themed, as I'm sort of reconnecting to my roots as I return here.
Yeah, well, and it's a fertile ground. Have you read David Joy's new one, most recent one?
Yeah. I've got a review up on the blog. I've only read a couple of his books thus far.
Yeah. I got the owner of our independent bookstore here in Sisters, a guy named Lane Jacobson, came here from North Carolina. He purchased the bookstore and moved here to run it. And he and David Joy are good friends, and so he finagled him. They did a book festival last October, which was fantastic, and they couldn't do it again this year because of COVID. They were going to do it in the spring, and but David Joy came out for it, and what an interesting guy! Just a really, really cool guy. Great oral storyteller, and not a lot of writers really are, but he's definitely got that. He's got that Southern backcountry skill of being an oral storyteller. And I really like his work. And have you read any Taylor Brown?
Yeah, I read, I forget the name of it now. One of his books that I loved, the one about the moonshiners.
No, I don't think it's the same guy. Taylor Brown's writing in Georgia. He wrote Kings of the River and Pride of Eden. I think you'd like him.
Yeah, I haven't read his stuff.
You're thinking of Gods of Howell Mountain. Yeah, that's Taylor Brown. Yeah, that's the one I haven't read.
Yeah, that one's excellent.
Yeah.
Joy's stuff is good. I to my knowledge haven't met Joy. We're contemporaries. In one of his books, he talks about knife fights at the Rusty Lizard. I was at the Rusty Lizard drinking on a fake ID the night that it opened, and the police did show up, as they did almost every night at the Rusty Lizard. It was a great backcountry bowling alley / club / knife fighting venue.
Nice. Alcohol and knives. What the hell? That's a fine American tradition right there.
Yeah. Well, you have your daily carry. I grew up as a kid carrying a knife, and that wasn't a weird thing. Which I don't know if my kid will grow up carrying a knife. Probably not at school.
Well, I'm sure not at school anymore. Yeah, no, that's But as far as I'm concerned, you're not dressed if you don't have a knife.
All right, so you now have 2 episodes published of your podcast, the first season, the first series, focusing on Kit Carson. So tell me about the podcast. Tell me why you chose to focus on Kit Carson.
Well, the way I've decided to set this up is I'm doing it in individual series on multiple episodes on particular topics. So I'm doing four episodes on Kit Carson with probably a supplemental piece, and then I'll take a couple weeks off and do my series on the Scottish Highlanders. And it's interesting because people have read my blog, and I'm sure you've seen it. I bitch about documentaries that cover the same people, the same famous people over and over. Billy the Kid, Wyatt, or Jesse James. They always get the Daniel Boone, for that matter, always get the press, and there's so many other stories to tell out there. And so it's kind of ironic that the first thing that I decided to do with the podcast was delving into the life and legacy of Kit Carson, because he's not lacking for press. Mm-hmm. The reason that I went there with it is that Carson's been controversial for a long time. Mm-hmm. He was sort of exalted as the sort of knight in buckskin frontiersman, making the West safe for Western civilization. And then when revisionist history started sort of flipping the coin a little bit in the 1960s, people started looking at him as an agent of genocide. And given the ways that we're conflicted over our history right now, I thought that Carson was a good place to really look at some of the questions of that are inherent in frontier history in a really stark light, because Carson did some dark deeds, and mostly the genocide accusation is thrown out in regards to the Navajo campaign in the 1860s, which was ethnic cleansing. I mean, they rounded up the Navajo basically by a scorched earth starvation campaign, and forced them to take the long walk to the Bosque Redondo reservation outside of their homeland, and it was a very harsh policy that Carson didn't create, but he enacted. Mm-hmm. And yet, I think that a lot of the assessment of Carson is taken out of his historical context. And so it just seemed like a really, given how fraught all of these kinds of issues are right now, issues of race and issues of conquest and issues of violence, that Carson was a good place to start looking at those questions, and with my own particular take on them. Mm-hmm. And
one of the things
it was very interesting to delve into his cultural background coming out of that Scots-Irish heritage, because there was a strong imprint from that culture mm-hmm. in his outlook, but in some ways he stepped outside of it. He was not unsympathetic to Indians, and his attitudes evolved over time as he got older and had different experiences with different, and you can't talk about Indians. They're distinct peoples, mm-hmm. Both as tribal groups and ethnic groups and linguistic groups, and as individuals. And he learned to really make a lot of distinctions. So he's truly a fascinating case. It's a great case study, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love what you do with the Frontier Partisans project, that you take this serious, nuanced view instead of just adopting one of two very simplistic stances, when public discourse today is so childish. So the opposite of what you were doing.
It is childish. People want very simplistic white hat, black hat ways of looking at things, and sometimes that's inverted from the old style of history that we learned, where the frontiersmen or the cowboys were the good guys and the Indians were the bad guys. Now it's the Indians are the good guys and the cowboys are the bad guys, and that's not life. It's not real, and it's a really fascinating human story if you really allow yourself to dig into it. And I'm not a huge George R.R. Martin fan. I really liked the the original Game of Thrones novel. I read a couple in that series and moved on. But I thought it was a great thing when Game of Thrones became such a big hit, because it really, that kind of gray area and that notion that people that you think are the villains of the story as well, they're the hero of their story and they have their reasons. I thought that was in a kind of a mythic setting, a good understanding of history, and I was happy to see people taking that in and buying into that kind of viewpoint.
Yeah, it's just so much more interesting. You hear people talk about three-dimensional characters. It's three-dimensional history, and to me, that's far more interesting than two-dimensional history.
Yep. You just said that in a much more succinct fashion than I did. You got to write a blog.
I try to do my best. Jim, thank you for joining us. Just end by letting people know where they can find your podcast.
My blog is at frontierpartisans.com, and there are links to the podcast from there. And the podcast is hosted on Podbean, but you can also find it on Spotify and Google Podcasts. It's the Frontier Partisans podcast. And thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure. I really do enjoy your work, and I hope sometime we can talk on the fantasy novel end of things a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that you have great insights and write really well and have great musical taste.
Thank you. And I love Frontier Partisans. I'm extraordinarily excited about your podcast, and thank you again for joining me.
All right. We'll see you down the trail.